Hello creatures, welcome back to Bound by Words. My name is Madie and today we are going to be talking about relatable characters. Super important, can't wait to get into it. Before I do, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you'll be notified when I post new videos on Mondays. Hello creatures, welcome back to Bound by Words. My name is Madie and today we are going to be talking about relatable characters. Something super important and I can't wait for it. Before we get into the video, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you'll be notified when I post new videos on Mondays. Alright guys, so today I have 8 tips for how to write good relatable characters. To be entirely honest, I just couldn't think of another 2 that I felt like were important enough to include in this video, so 8 is the number I'm going with and I stick to it. The first and I think one of the most important things that you have to keep in mind when you're writing characters is that whenever we're reading a story, we have to know enough about the character up front to relate to them, but we want to feel like we are getting to know them more as we read the story. So when you give your character their own quirks and their own idiosyncrasies and you want them to be very different and unique, we want to learn those things throughout the story. So tip number 1 is to incorporate those quirks throughout the story instead of in the beginning of the story telling us that he always runs his hand through his hair when he's nervous. Go through your story and pick all of the places where your character gets nervous or gets stressed out and have him run his hand through his hair. Show us that instead of just telling us up front. If you have a character whose room has to be absolutely meticulously clean and no matter what, everything has to be in its spot, of course you can mention this up front, but it'll help to solidify it if throughout the story you see that they are putting everything away as soon as they're done using it. You see somebody come in and misplace something and they immediately just put it back in the right spot. So you want to incorporate these quirks throughout the story and we want to see more and more of them and we want to learn to recognize them as the story goes on. Think about meeting new people in real life. You might see some of their quirks up front, but you don't recognize them as those little things that make them unique until you get to know them and you see it happen in action over and over again. So keep that in mind whenever you're making relatable characters because we want them to seem as human as possible. So tip number 2 is to make your characters unique from each other. So we have a lot of advice floating around about author's voice and how to make your writing uniquely yours and strong and really good craft-wise, but if we're being honest, characters have their own voice too. We have a voice we read in our head whenever we're reading different protagonists, and it's based on their attitude and the way they speak and the way they talk. So you want your characters in your book to have very different voices and very different ways of expressing themselves. And the most important reason you want to do this is because people are really different. People have very different reactions to the things that are happening around them, whether it is the way somebody worded something, whether they have a list of things to do, and it's just the priority in which they do them. The voice and the way that you use adjectives and the way that you describe things and the way that you draw attention to things should be unique from character to character. I was recently reading a book that had the hot boy in school kind of stereotype, and he was sitting with the protagonist in the car and they were talking and he was drumming his fingertips on the steering wheel, and then just a few pages later the girl's grandmother was in a car with her and she was talking and she was drumming her fingertips on the steering wheel, the exact same wording, the exact same sentence structure, and that's not entirely realistic. Now of course it's not impossible, but as a reader that's something I definitely picked up on, that they didn't have unique little traits of their own, that the characters were sharing traits, and you don't want that. You want your characters to be as different as possible. So think about that in the way that you word things as we are following your protagonist. We want to hear how they specifically are viewing things and how they think about things. So tips number 3 and 4 both have to do with dialogue. Now the first one, tip number 3, is to make it realistic, and I feel like there can be a dozen videos just on dialogue and how to do it well and it would still be barely scratching the surface. But I feel like the gist when it comes to making relatable characters is to have dialogue that is relatable to human speech. People speak in contractions, people interrupt each other, people speak in run-on sentences and clip sentences, and they have these variations that are different from person to person. So you want the dialogue of your character to be uniquely human. We as readers and humans want to read dialogue in books that make sense to us. We want to read dialogue that sounds like an interaction between people. We don't want to read dialogue that is robotic because people are forcing correct punctuation and they're taking out contractions. Something that always comes up in the editing program is how you don't change dialogue. It's like, this is the rule and this is the rule and this is the rule, but then there's always this subsection underwards that's like, unless it's dialogue, dialogue because we want the dialogue to be how people speak. We don't necessarily want it to be formal prose. So number 4 is to write dialogue that is consistent with your character's voice, which is what we talked about in point number 2. So you want your character to have a unique voice that has a unique way of describing things and viewing the world, because that's what people find relatable. We find other realistic people to be relatable. So if you describe your character in prose, say you're writing from first person and we're right in the head of the protagonist, and you're describing your prose in a way that is very calm and relaxing and no stress, and we'll do it when we'll do it, it'll get done, everything's gonna be okay. But then every time your character speaks to somebody, they are tense or anxious or worried and suspicious or whatever it is. If your dialogue for that character doesn't match up with their internal speech, then we're gonna pick up on that as readers. We're gonna recognize that there's a disconnect there, and it's gonna feel like the person that we're following in the story and the person we're hearing speak are two different creatures. Now, this is only true if the person who is narrating your story is the protagonist. If somebody else is narrating your story, then you want the narration to sound different than the dialogue. You want them to sound like two separate identities. Number 5 is something that can be done really well or butchered very easily, and that is hobbies. So people do things in their free time. Nobody wakes up and stares at a wall and doesn't do anything and then just eats and sleeps and that's it. That's their whole life. Nobody lives like that. Everybody has hobbies, even if their hobby is working. Maybe they work too much and they don't have time to do something else. Maybe their hobby is scrolling through their phone. Maybe their hobby is sitting in front of the TV. These are all things that don't sound like very exciting or very hard things to do, but they are hobbies. They are pastimes. Give your protagonist something they do in their free time. Maybe they're an artist and they paint and they draw. Maybe they make music. Maybe they work out. Whatever it is, give them something to do in their spare time. And you don't want to write huge sections, Flurry's coming to join, but you don't want to write huge sections of them doing something that might not benefit the plot, but you do want to incorporate little nuggets of their hobbies and the things that they enjoy to do in their free time into the story and into their personality. If they are really comfortable sitting on their couch in front of the TV and that's just what they do whenever they don't have anywhere else to be, then after a long day of dealing stuff, maybe they just want to sit at home and be in front of the TV. If their hobby is going to hang out with their friends and being at a certain person's house and they have a huge lifestyle switch where that person isn't in their life anymore, you should hint to the fact that something happened and they wanted to go over their house but they couldn't. And the reason I feel like this can be done very poorly sometimes is because sometimes when we're reading a character, it seems like their hobby was forced on them for a little bit of uniqueness. Like they are a painter, but they don't actually talk about how they like colors that complement or how they like certain focuses in certain angles, and it just doesn't feel realistic. So instead of incorporating big scenes with your character's hobbies, which is great to do if it helps and furthers your plots, but instead of doing that, put in little nuggets throughout the story that hint to their hobby or that solidify their hobby. So maybe if they spend all of their time listening to music, they hear certain patterns and certain notes in the way that birds sing. Maybe if they spend all of their free time doing puzzles, they are a little bit more witty or they see things in a way that other characters might not. So give your characters hobbies. Everybody does something in their spare time. Like I said, nobody stares at a wall. Give them something to do and have it add to their personality. So the point of all of these tips is not to make a complicated list of things that you have to figure out and put together. The point of gathering and adding things like this is to slowly, through little bits of information throughout your story, make your character seem like a real person. So the 6th one is dislikes. Give your character dislikes. I feel like everyone always gives their character things they like and enjoy, but they don't always put any emphasis on things that they don't like. And very few people just don't not like anything, you know? Some people just can't stand to be in the sun. Some people can't stand the taste of a certain type of food. Little things like that. And it doesn't have to be a strong like hate, but it can be a slight dislike. And having things they dislike can actually feed into the conflict very easily. So if they really dislike whenever people roll their eyes, or they really dislike whenever people turn away from them while they're talking, maybe tension is building up and something's about to happen and somebody says something and just turns to walk away and it just breaks them because they dislike it so much that they can't not react. And that means they're going to act poorly, and that's going to create a conflict, and it's going to give you some tension and further your plot. So don't force dislikes that don't matter on your characters, but when it is appropriate, evaluate, are there things they don't like? Maybe they went to somebody's house and they're making good relations with somebody, whether it is high fantasy or contemporary, and they just can't stand this certain type of food or this certain type of seasoning, and it's in everything. And they're trying to be polite while trying not to gag. We, as real people, relate to things like that. Number 7, another fun one, is strengths and weaknesses. And I feel like people look over this one a lot because we talk about how our characters should have wants and needs and desires. But strengths and weaknesses are a big thing your character needs too, and it's very different from likes and dislikes. So I think some common stereotypes that we recognize with the strengths and the weaknesses are like the jock who is very physically fit or beautiful but is absolutely dumb, or the nerd who is just very scrawny and hard to talk to. We see these stereotypes all the time and we recognize them for being cliches. But let's take those cliches, or let's take those things that are worn out and give a new spin on them in our stories. So give your characters things that they are good at and things that they are not good at that may or may not have anything to do with their likes and dislikes, and have those things work together in some way. I think the Throne of Glass series is really popular. The protagonist is a really good assassin, but she really doesn't like killing people. Things like that. So instead of having a cliche like a bad boy who is incredibly overprotective, that he misses important things that are going on or important social cues because he is just so worried about being protective. Instead of having that cliche stereotype, maybe you have your bad boy who is super overprotective but is too shy and self-conscious to actually stand up for the person because they feel like it's not their place. Mess around with the balance of what is your character good at and what is your character bad at. And I think a good thing to think about whenever you are picking your likes and dislikes versus your strengths and weaknesses is subjects in school. So I think it's very common for people to excel in one or two subjects and then really dislike one or two other subjects. And those usually have nothing to do with the fact if you like it or not like it. I was really good at math in school. It just was logic and it made sense. But honestly, I don't enjoy doing it. And as soon as I was out of the mandatory math classes, I never took another math class again. And my weakness is history. And it's not necessarily that I hate it. I'm just really bad at memorizing dates and people's names and things that happen. So strengths and weaknesses just add another level to characters, and it also gives them a good way to develop. So when you have strengths and weaknesses, that's like a good setup for a character arc. So if you already have your character arc figured out, then think about what their weakness is at the beginning and think if there's any way that you can play on that or change it or even incorporate it into your story more so it's evident that that's something that they're not good at. And last but not least, tip number 8 is don't forget bodily functions. Yes, it would be incredibly annoying if authors included every time the character ate or drank or slept, but there are certain situations where you really need to highlight or bring in the fact that they have a physical body that is under stress, that is overwhelmed, that is underwhelmed. You need to highlight these and bring these into scenes that are happening. If your character is in a long trek through the desert and it's the middle of summer, of course they're going to be hot and they're going to be sweaty and they're going to be tired and they're going to be emotionally drained. But you can also talk about the painful thirst. Their saliva is thick, they're getting cramps in their abdomen. Bring their body into it because we as humans, we have bodies that we live in and we understand that and we relate to that, and that's what making relatable characters is about. So no, don't include every bathroom break into your story, but maybe your character just stepped into their house and they had a visitor they didn't know they had and they're trying to be polite and they have some reason why they can't walk away, some deep conversation. Maybe they walked in and the visitor accused them of something and they're trying to stand there with a straight face, but at the same time they have to go to the bathroom so bad that they just can't think about anything else. We as readers relate to that, but it's not just the things that your characters need to do, it's also the things that they need a break from. So yes, your characters will sometimes need food and they will sometimes need water and they will sometimes need to do something so desperately that it takes over their mind, but they also might need a break from something in the same capacity. Maybe they've been in the sun for hours and they're just so irritated because they're in the sun and it's just making them angry about everything. Maybe they need a break. Maybe everything is so loud they can't think straight and it makes them snap snap. Think about the things that they need for their physical being and when it is appropriate to incorporate these things into the story. And some of these points that we just went over also help the character interact with other characters, and it helps them interact with the setting, and it really combats the white room syndrome. In the last example, if it's really sunny and they're irritated, that lends to the setting. It is sunny and it is hot, the same as if it is really loud. If your character is in a really noisy room and it's driving them crazy, maybe somebody is tapping their pencil, then it helps them interact with the setting and the things that are happening around them and other characters that are coming and going in your book. Going back to the first tip, their quirk can be something that interacts with the setting around them. Maybe they have to touch the door frame when they go into or out of a room. So incorporating these kind of little nuggets consistently throughout your story will make your character seem like a real person. It'll make them seem like somebody that we can relate to, or that we might have something in common with, or that we understand how their mind works and functions. If this video helped you at all, make sure you give it a thumbs up and consider hitting the subscribe button. I post writing related videos every Monday.